welcome Jim Honest to the stage.
Thanks, Guy. Is this on?
Yep.
Thanks, Guy, for having me. And it was interesting what you read to begin with about New Orleans. I'm going to go upriver a little bit and to the right, more ways than one. And I'm going to go a little bit, and I'm going to go with the theory more that not interesting places have interesting stories, but even not uninteresting places have interesting stories. And I think hopefully you'll know what I mean after I finish my story. The name of this story is Transubstantiation on the Ohio. When I was in elementary school, my teacher, Mrs. Richter, brought up the subject of religion in my third grade class, which was completely inappropriate since this was a public school. And she just started asking kids what their religion was, like it was Iran or something. And many of them told her as she worked her way around the room. I don't even know what I said or if she got to me, but I remember coming home confused. "Are we Catholic?" I asked my mom. "No," she said, "we're Protestants." "What does that mean?" "It means we're not Catholic." Now, my mother is no theologian, but she was basically right. We weren't anything really. We were Protestant by default rather than conviction. The last private school I attended was a Presbyterian preschool, and on the rare occasions when we went to church, we went to a place that literally said Christian Church across the front, like a big white box of generic cornflakes. Once at a sleepover, a friend's father asked me what religion we were, so I passed on a joke my mother liked to tell. "We're Presbyterians," I told him. "We believe that when you die, your soul lands on the roof." And this didn't get that big of a laugh at the time, and I think there was actually some danger that we would be reported to child protectors. But to fully understand my confusion, you have to understand a little Midwestern geography. I'm from the south side of Cincinnati, which is also known as Kentucky. You'll know this if you've ever flown into the Cincinnati airport, which is in Kentucky. Otherwise, most New Yorkers assume Kentucky borders Mississippi, and that Ohio is somewhere near Iowa. But they do border each other, divided only by the Ohio River. This is an ambiguous part of the country. It's not really north or south, or rather it's north or south, depending on where you happen to be when you're talking about it. Right here on McDougal Street, it's pretty much the south. But I lived in Memphis for 10 years, and there, people's eyes would light up when I first said I was from Kentucky. "Oh, what part?" they'd say. And I'd say, up from Cincinnati." "Uh-huh," they'd say. I might as well have said Boston. Historically, Cincinnati was founded by two groups of people. The first group came up from Kentucky, as some of my family did. The polite term for these people is Scots-Irish Americans, but the preferred term is hillbillies. And in Cincinnati, they have a special term. They call them briars or briar hoppers, so called because they once came up from the hills with briars still stuck to their overalls. The other group of people were Catholics from southern Germany. I don't know how they got there, but when they arrived, the hills reminded them of the foothills of the Alps near Munich, I suppose. So they built a city and went about creating industry. Now, obviously, these groups don't naturally get along. In fact, the know-nothings of the mid-19th century, the Tea Partiers of their day, claimed there was a plot afoot to establish a second Vatican in the U.S., right there in Cincinnati. This was basically a rumor that the Briars started to get even for being called Briars. But fortunately, at least for the modern Republican Party, these two groups have found some common ground. They agree that poor people are lazy and that sex is disgusting. It's kind of sweet, really. I mean, Protestant refugees from a Catholic country and Catholic refugees from a Protestant country converging in what more than a century later would become a swing state and helping to elect George W. Bush president twice? See, we can all get along. But don't wait for the late returns from Hamilton County to swing to the Democrat on election night. You'll be waiting a very long time. And this unique blend also led Cincinnati to be the only city in the history of the country to bring an art exhibit up on criminal pornography charges. You might remember the Mapplethorpe scandal. Other places they took it to court because there were taxpayer dollars involved. In Cincinnati, there were no taxpayers at all involved, but the claim was that it was actually illegal to present that material in Cincinnati in any form, no matter who was paying. So anyway, enough historical background, but a little more geographic. I grew up in a little town called Erlanger, which is just south of Covington, Kentucky, where the downtown looks like the West German Pavilion at the Knoxville World's Fair. And I went to the Knoxville World's Fair. Which is to say, almost everyone I knew was German and Catholic, which is why I came home from Mrs. Richter's class thinking we might be too. I grew up with kids with names like Kant and Hegel and Schiller. I mean, names like that. I've replaced the names with the names of 19th century German philosophers to protect their identity. But you get the idea. And although these were my friends, they were a real mystery to me, like superheroes or something. I was an only child, and they had these huge families. They were wild, or what one might now call troubled. But they were also carefree and entirely at ease with wildness and trouble. They drank heavily from tender ages and had real talent for bouncing quarters into shot glasses from impossible distances. They fought. They stole for the thrill of it. They vandalized things and were defiant if caught. Sometimes they were even arrested, but never were they worried any more than their parents seemed to be. My youth, on the other hand, was a trial of keeping up with risk-taking for which I did not feel existentially or spiritually prepared. While the whole world around me glowed with the conviction that everything would turn out all right, I couldn't beat the feeling that sudden, irreversible doom was waiting. Anxiety. That was our real religion. I tagged along the best I could, but it didn't come easily. I'd be over at Mike Schopenhauer's house eating listening to Who records. We listened to the Who for some reason. This was like the 80s. And playing Dungeons and Dragons, having what I thought was plenty of excitement. But the time would always come when everyone would decide it was time to break into the high school football field and run through the sprinklers or go hiking through Pea Green, a remote drainage creek that seemed like a great place to break your leg and never be heard from again. It was like they weren't happy unless they were periodically jumping over barbed wire. In the greatest act of bravado I have ever witnessed to this day, John Holderlin, and admittedly Holderlin's not a philosopher, he's a poet, but it's not this guy's real name, hit a car with a snowball, and then he got in the driver's face when confronted, angrily denying that he had done anything, when we'd all seen him do it. Now, at the time, this fearlessness seemed like it couldn't possibly be a function of their religion, because they were all terrible Catholics. I was always helping them create elaborate alibis about where and when they were supposedly attending Mass, alibis that confounded rather than convinced, but played to their parents' presumptive, and to me, mysterious, feeling of well-being. The highlight of every summer in Erlanger, which provides the most vivid memories of this part of my anxious youth, was the St. Henry's Carnival. It used to be right up McAlpin Avenue from my parents' house, and it was always involved a grueling game of cat and mouse with my friends' parents, who manned the various concessions. We'd be sneaking around, smoking, chewing tobacco, this is Kentucky after all, guzzling beers. I was terrified to run into my own parents, but my friends weren't too concerned, fearless as they were. I can still remember the anxiety and the constant ringing of this cowbell at the centermost booth. There was always a crowd there, and it was not easy to see. I think I was in my teens before I got a good look. Because, of course, at all these Catholic carnivals, there's a lot of games of chance, and they kind of go up the ladder. For the kids, you have the thing where you pay and you pick a duck, and that's got a number on the bottom of it, and you win the prize. And then you also have the one where you can place $1 on a number, and they'll spin the big wheel. But the one that always had people huddled around it, and the big cowbell going, was, and this is true, is that they had a gigantic circular wheel with colored wedges and holes in the bottom, and in the middle of it they would place a large rat. I'm serious, like a laboratory rat. And they would cover it in like a dish, like you would serve something in, and they would take it off, and they would spin the wheel, and they would ring the cowbell, and you could bet $1 on what color the rat went down. Now I always thought this was kind of rigged, but I presume that rats are colorblind. And just to be clear, there were actually 2 rats. because they would alternate them. They would spell the rats because they had to keep this going all night. And basically, I felt like young Goodman Brown at the Witches' Sabbath. As all these men huddled around throwing dollars at this terrified animal. And this bell still rings in my head as the stand-in for all the anxiety I felt trying to keep up with these blonde, blue-eyed beasts who were my friends. Yesterday I was telling someone this story. He's here tonight, Mr. Kincannon. And he said he thought my friends were just wild because they were rebelling against a restrictive religion. And that makes some sense. I mean, I ended up with a fascination with Catholicism. And I love all the Catholic writers, from G.K. Chesterton to Walker Percy, perhaps because of my mother's early insistence that we were not Catholic. But I've come to believe that something else was going on with my friends. I go back from time to time, and it seems like, well, basically they were right and I was wrong. Everything was going to work out. Or it seems to have all worked out for most of them. The vast majority of the young Catholics I knew growing up married each other, and they became older Catholics, taking up golf and no longer lying about when or where they attended Mass. The cycle of life turned, and I found it hard to beat the feeling that all along they had been plugged into something larger, a 2,000-year-old confidence where I had only doubt and fear. And then one night, maybe 10 years ago, I could tell from the cars parked in front of my parents' house that it was carnival time. I walked up McAlpin Avenue to take a look, and it was the same as I remembered it, more or less. Red-faced men stood around in half-open shirts and coaches shorts, deep into clear plastic cups. Women in T-shirts advertising beaches in Florida and North Carolina manned the food booths, tiny diamond crosses peeking from their collars. Loud, tow-headed children ran back and forth, talking quickly about things they needed or wanted, or someone, a sibling or a friend's sibling, who they hoped would be brought to justice. The teenagers loitered in gender-segregated packs, a line crossed only by the most guilelessly popular, the tiny cheerleader or the gangly basketball player whose parents have a pool and have managed to stay out of the gossip that hops across the back decks of the diocese like loose fireworks. The girls wore pastel, sleeveless sweaters and capri pants. The boys wore bleached white T-shirts and pressed golf shirts that they stuffed into their straight-leg jeans. They spit tobacco juice into soda cans and sipped little King's Cream ales disguised as big gulps, just like we had. But the rats were gone. The booth was there, with the wheel and the colored square, but the rats were all gone, replaced by a small pink rubber ball that couldn't even hear the bell. But it still rang. And I know what you're thinking. PETA must have gotten them, right? They said, come on, rats, you can't do this. We're putting an end to this. But that's not what immediately came to my mind. As soon as I saw that the rat had been transformed into a pink rubber ball, I knew what had happened, as sure as if I'd attended all the CCD classes my childhood friends had ever skipped. What had happened here was a miracle, plain and simple.